And also, as I said, we'll get the blog up and rolling, but until then, please just send us your comments by email. We can always keep improving things. So now we'll let you go to this exciting panel. Karen.
Thanks, Karen. I'm very pleased to be here moderating the Reproductive Rights and Gay Rights panel. And we're going to talk about Sissy's involvement in both of these areas, the interrelations between them, and how far we've come or not since the 1960s and 70s in these contexts. So I can't possibly do justice to this incredibly impressive array of folks next to me, but I'll just give a brief bio, and then you can read the more fulsome bios in your programs. I'll start with Louise Trubeck. She is a clinical professor of law emeritus at the University of Wisconsin Law School. She works in the area of health law, public interest law, and regulation and governance. She was the named plaintiff in Trubeck v. Ullman, a case about which we'll hear more shortly. And Khiara Bridges is associate professor of law and anthropology at BU School of Law. She works in the area of critical race theory, reproductive rights, equal protection, and substantive due process. Marianne Case is the Arnold I. Shure Professor of Law at the University of Chicago Law School. She studies, teaches, and writes in feminist jurisprudence, constitutional law, European legal systems, marriage, and the regulation of sexuality. Rachel Rebouché is Associate Professor of Law at Temple University Beasley School of Law. Her areas of expertise include family law, health law, comparative family law. And finally, last but not least, Ray Hill has been a prominent LGBT rights advocate in Houston, Texas since 1966. He has founded many things, including the Gay Political Caucus, the Houston Human Rights League, and the Prison Show, which airs on 90.1 FM in Houston. So I will turn it over to the panelists after a brief introduction of the documents. I haven't told the panelists that I've been given these cards, so just to give you a warning, I will be using these cards if you are running over your time. In speaking about the following documents, right, we have 4 documents assigned to this panel, and hopefully you've had a chance to look at them on the web. But if not, I thought I would provide just a minute of discussion about what they are, so you'll know what the panelists are referring to. I'm going to do this in chronological order. Right, the first document is the report of the Organizing Conference of the National Women's Political Caucus, and this is from 1971. After Congress's failure to pass the ERA in 1970, the National Women's Political Caucus was founded at an organizing conference that was attended by hundreds of women from more than 26 states. The aims of the caucus were to reach every woman, quote, whose abilities have been wasted by second-class, subservient, underpaid, or powerless positions to which female human beings are consigned. Its wide-ranging feminist agenda included fighting not just sexism, but racism, institutional violence, and poverty as well. That's the first document. The second document, set of documents, is correspondence relating to abortion that Sissy wrote in 1972. These are letters to officials in the Catholic Church by Sissy explaining that personally and as a Roman Catholic she opposes abortion, but she believes that the decision must be left to the woman herself, and she thinks this is a viable position for Catholic office holders to take. The third document is a speech about abortion at the third Biennial Conference of the National Women's Political Caucus in 1977. Farenthold delivered this speech chronicling the shift in the nation to the right on the topic of abortion in all 3 branches of government. She started out with a quote from Jimmy Carter. He was asked about the inability of poor women to get abortions, and the president says, as you know, there are many things in life that aren't fair. Right? Many things wealthy people can afford and poor people can't. Right? Sissy didn't think too much of that response to the question. And finally, there's a gay rights speech from a Houston town meeting in 1978. It's an early gay rights organizing event in Houston, and Sissy begins by asking why a straight white woman with 4 children is addressing an assembled crowd of gay and lesbians. And she then gives an impassioned account of the interconnectedness of various strands of the fight for human rights. And with that, I'm going to turn over the microphone to Louise Trubeck.
Okay. Should we move this down? Yeah. Okay. Well, of course, I'm delighted to be here. and to meet Sissy, having read the documents and figuring out how to talk about my experience and some overlap with her experience. So my husband and I were plaintiffs in a lawsuit in the U.S. Supreme Court.
Put the microphone a little closer.
Okay. Is it on?
It's better.
It's on. You can hear me now? All right. Start again. My husband and I were plaintiffs in a lawsuit in the U.S. Supreme Court challenging the Connecticut statute that criminalized the use and prescription of birth control in the state of Connecticut. The lawsuit, Poe v. Ullman and Trubeck v. Ullman, was decided by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1961. The lawsuit claimed the statute prevented the use and prescription of birth control by married couples who desired to use birth control. The goal of the case was to allow Planned Parenthood to open a birth control clinic in New Haven, which could have been deemed a criminal act. The case was thrown out by the court based on lack of standing. The plaintiffs had not proved that access was denied. Subsequent to that decision, a clinic was opened. It was shut down by the authorities. A case was filed, and Griswold v. Connecticut was decided by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1965. That decision is the famous jurisprudential landmark leading to Roe v. Wade in 1973 that declared that some of the barriers to an abortion were unconstitutional, and Lawrence v. Texas in 2003, which struck down bans on consensual same-sex activities and is cited in upholding same-sex marriage. I see today my role as a plaintiff in Trubeck v. Ullman as a prism to reflect on my personal and professional life. Our professors at the Yale Law School recruited us to be the plaintiffs. We were both law students. I share with Sissy the experience of being one of a small number of female law students. I was one of 6. Of course, Yale is a much smaller law school, so there were not 600 students. There were 160 a class, so it may have been 400 altogether. The lawyers for the plaintiffs, a well-known Yale law professor, Fowler Harper, and an outstanding woman lawyer, Catherine Rohrbach, sought a married student couple who could represent people who wanted access to birth control to plan their families in ways that would permit women to pursue a career, create a warm and sharing marriage, and produce wanted children. The other plaintiffs were couples whose health or life were at stake if birth control was unavailable. They were anonymous. We used our name. Recently, I reviewed the archives of Catherine Rohrbach, and I want to say here, and then I'll say later, how impressed I am with the archival work that's being done here and how important those archives are. And because I was so impressed, I went back and looked at the archives of Catherine Rohrbach that are available at Emory Law School. She gave her archives to Emory Law School. Several documents in the Rohrbach archives interest me. The first is a 1959 interview with me by Catherine Rohrbach. That was the basis for the complaint. The complaint states that I wanted to finish my professional education and plan and space my children within a marriage. My vision of my life was marriage and children combined with a career. Birth control was the crucial factor. Reading these words reminded me of how early in my life I had this vision of my life and embarked on the road to achieve it. The second document is the brief in our case in the Supreme Court written by Fowler Harper. He discusses how birth control allows sexuality to flourish within marriage, allowing a couple to attain physical, emotional, and physical health, citing many medical experts. He made this argument in part to answer the state who presented abstinence as the way to prevent pregnancy. Abstinence meaning the rhythm method, because, of course, these were married couples we're talking about here. While I would not have presented my case in that fashion, I realized that in the 1950s there was medical and popular documentation supporting the separation of sex from reproduction as a key element in a successful marriage. Our case presented arguments and legal bases for birth control as an essential element for a fulfilling life. My ability to combine a career and children within marriage and our engagement in a sexual relationship without fear or limitations. This set of arguments dramatically differs from the arguments for the other plaintiffs who had serious health concerns. So Trubeck v. Ullman provides a vision of a type of equal marriage and the legal framework that supports such a vision. Trubeck v. Ullman was also my initial exposure to the complex world of law, social change, and social justice, with all its triumphs, surprises, and discontents. My almost 50-year career includes practice as a public interest lawyer, teaching public interest law, and writing about the practice. My involvement in Trubeck v. Ullman as a plaintiff in a social change litigation was prescient. In 2012, I wrote an op-ed piece that was published in the New York Times. I expressed disappointment that despite the legal successes eventually achieved in Griswold, women are still fighting for access to birth control. I said, can we still be arguing about a woman's ability to control her own fertility? Why are issues that the court decided so long ago still unresolved? We still have not provided all the support women need to combine rewarding careers and healthy families. Sissy expressed a similar concern in 1977. This is, of course, much earlier than my op-ed piece. She stated in regard to the passage of a prohibition on family planning services, I thought we had Roe v. Wade. While I expressed surprise in 2012 that birth control was an ongoing struggle, my long experience with using law to provide social justice and social change teaches me that court cases are just the beginning. The long, hard struggle about birth control access for all is echoed in my subsequent career. My work as a public interest lawyer focused more on the nitty-gritty of implementing laws rather than just winning formal victories in court. Looking back on Griswold and the cases that led to it, I see two lessons that I learned the hard way in subsequent years. The first is what the case was designed to achieve, the creation of structures to ensure that rights gained in law will be realized in life. The cases were about making it possible to open a Planned Parenthood clinic to serve poor women. In the story of birth control litigation, Trubeck v. Ullman and Griswold have to be seen as linked to the movement for reproductive rights going back to the early 1900s and the story of Margaret Sanger and Planned Parenthood. That movement tied reproductive rights for all women to the opening of free clinics where support and medical resources could be obtained. Now, Carrie Franklin has just written a very interesting article where she calls this, that is, the provision of medical services and support, an infrastructure of provision. She says in that article, it teaches us that public structures may be essential to the vindication of 14th Amendment rights. The second is the importance of state-based activism. The cases before Griswold were important organizing tools for lawyers, activists, and doctors. They kept reproductive rights before the public and connected provision of needed services for the poor to legal barriers prior to the breakthrough decision in Griswold. My public interest law career reflects that path to change. I practiced and wrote about how to advocate for poor people, women, and disadvantaged groups at the state level using all the tools available. I want to now commend Sissy for saving her papers and donating them to Texas. And many thanks to the Rapoport Center for encouraging the use of these documents, which is very laudatory, and organizing discussions like this conference today. Looking at the past and thinking about the future is both a personal and societal enterprise. Thanks.
Thank you. So I'm really happy to be here to celebrate the life and career of an incredibly remarkable woman. So I'm here because I write about reproductive rights, reproductive justice, and race. So if you don't mind, I'd like to tell a little personal story. So I was probably in my second year of law school when I first was introduced to the court's decisions in Mayer v. Roe and Harris v. McRae. And most of you are familiar with those decisions, but for those of you who are not, Mayer v. Roe was decided in 1977, and it held that the 14th Amendment was not at all disturbed by, Connecticut was on a roll apparently, so it was not at all disturbed by Connecticut's decision to use its Medicaid funds to only cover the medically necessary abortions of indigent women. Thus, that meant that in Connecticut, an indigent woman couldn't use Medicaid in order to terminate a pregnancy that did not threaten her health or her life. And the court in Mayer v. Roe held that this funding decision, which had the known effect of making it difficult, if not impossible, for indigent women to access abortion in Connecticut, the court held that that didn't in any way undermine its holding in Roe v. Wade, which held that the state could not erect barriers in the first trimester to abortion and could only regulate abortion in the second trimester in order to protect women's health. So that was Mayer v. Roe in 1977. Harris v. McRae picks up where Mayer v. Roe left off in 1980. And Harris v. McRae upheld the Hyde Amendment. And the Hyde Amendment, which is still good law, is still in effect today, prohibits federal Medicaid funds from being used to cover even those, all abortions, even those that are medically necessary for indigent women. So even when an abortion might save an indigent woman from being maimed, right, from going blind, from having to have a leg amputated, Medicaid funds can't be used to fund that abortion. Even when an abortion might save a woman's mental health, right, save her sanity, save her from psychological damage, federal Medicaid funds can't be used to fund that abortion. So, like I mentioned, I was in my second year of law school when I was first introduced to Harris v. McRae and Mayer v. Roe, and it was probably 2000 or 2001. And I just thought the decisions were pure sophistry. I thought I was taking crazy pills. Like, you know, I was in my mind, I was like, how could the court say in Roe v. Wade that the Constitution prohibits states from doing something, and that doing something is erecting a barrier to abortion, but when the state goes ahead and does it anyway, how could that be consistent with the Constitution? I just couldn't wrap my mind around it. And beyond thinking that the court's decisions were pure sophistry, I mean, they were the reason why people don't like lawyers. Lawyers make arguments that you know are wrong, but they make them in such a way that you're like, oh, maybe that actually makes sense, but it doesn't. That's what Harris v. McRae and Mayer v. Roe is. So beyond thinking that the cases were examples of, yes, that's why people don't like lawyers, I was enraged. I was, even though I was a baby in 2000, 2001, it was patently obvious to me that the decision meant that the right to abortion would remain highly significant for wealthier women, and it would be meaningless. It would be very insignificant to poorer women, and the inequality of it all just sickened me. And so I think it's sophistry. I was enraged, but then I was enraged that other people weren't enraged either. I was in an abortion law class at the time, and my abortion law professor, you know, she seemed strangely accepting of the decisions. Like, she was able to describe them to me calmly, much more calmly than I was able to describe them to other people. So fast forward to 2015. I still find it curious how abortion rights activists are not up in arms about the Hyde Amendment. Like I said, it's still good law. They are rightfully enraged about a host of decisions that have functioned to stigmatize women seeking abortions, like ultrasound viewing laws. Now states are requiring women to look at their fetuses prior to an abortion. Biased counseling laws. States are basically telling women horrible things or ideologically charged things about the fetus in order to make women just feel bad about their decisions. States are now telling women that their fetus might feel pain, which is not medically established. So abortion rights activists fight these laws because, you know, they require women to be especially resilient when they are seeking to terminate a pregnancy. But for the most part, abortion rights activists are not furious about the Hyde Amendment, which precludes many indigent women from terminating a pregnancy, no matter how resilient they are. So you can just imagine my delight and surprise when I came across the speech that Sissy Farenthold made at the National Women's Political Conference in 1977. And she gave the speech just 3 months after the court handed down its decision in Mayer v. Roe. And believe you me, she was enraged by the court's decision. To be fair, she let all 3 branches of the government have it that day. With respect to the political branches, she did say, quote, well, elective officials are not necessarily courageous people. Burn. But she was palpably enraged by the court's decision in Mayer v. Roe and other then recently decided decisions that rendered the right to abortion for indigent women an empty promise. She stated in that speech, I've read and reread these decisions, and there is beautiful and meaningful language in some of the opinions. The only problem is that the language is found in the dissents. Burn. So I found it fulfilling to come across Sissy's rage. The Hyde Amendment is, after all, outrageous, and I think we need to remember just how outrageous the Hyde Amendment is in 2015. And so I want to end by noting that some activists have taken Sissy's rage at the court's willingness to make reproductive rights meaningless and transformed her rage and their rage into a movement that recognizes that reproductive rights have very little consequence when those rights are disconnected from women's lives. This is the reproductive justice movement. So reproductive justice requires rights. It requires the abortion right, but it also requires good quality health care, education, housing, child care, decent labor practices. So the reproductive justice says, yes, we need rights. We even need the narrowly formulated rights that made Sissy's blood boil in 1977, but it also requires social structures responsive to domestic violence and infertility and child custody and environmental racism and population control and et cetera, et cetera. So at the very end of that speech, Sissy said, quote, the right to abortion has become a class issue, a race issue, a privacy issue, and even a consumer issue. And the reproductive justice movement recognizes that. It focuses on the intersections of race, class, gender, sexuality, et cetera, and it says that matters of fertility don't exist independent of those social and political structures. And so I read Sissy's recognition of that in her rage that she exhibited in 1977, and I take my proverbial hat off to her intuition, her insight, and her bravery. Thank you.
So I'm delighted to be here. I grew up in Dallas. For those of you who know Dallas, I grew up in Oak Cliff, which is South Dallas, and I was a lawyer before an academic for national women's rights groups, and I heard Sissy speak in college here in Austin, and so I am just delighted to be here. And I want to thank especially Karen and Billy and Rhiannon for this amazing conference and this amazing archive. So, as you know, we've been asked to anchor our remarks in Sissy's prior remarks, and like Khiara, I was really struck by the 1977 speech to the National Women's Political Caucus, where she lamented, as Khiara noted, the tradition of the Burger Court and the decisions that, in her words, quote, have fallen most cruelly on those least able to protect themselves. And she saw very clearly the class implications of decisions like Maher and Beal, handed down that year of her speech and just 4 years after Roe. She cited with approval Justice Blackmun in dissent, the good parts of the cases, that funding restrictions on abortions, quote, deny the realization and enjoyment of the right with punitive and tragic results for women without resources. So Karen suggested that I might talk about funding for abortion, and in preparing my remarks, I thought about class and the context of class and socioeconomic rights of women in 3 ways. The first is one that Khiara already mentioned, sources of funding for abortion, the Hyde Amendment, what states have done, and the Affordable Care Act. The second are the increasing costs of abortion services with clinic closures and trap laws, a topic that should be close and near to many of you in this room. And I want to talk a little bit about HB2. And then I want to leave the conversation with a quick comment on funding of the reproductive rights or reproductive justice movement. We've got a lot of money, so how should we use it? And that's the comment I want to leave for conversation and Q&A and the conversation for the panel. So as Khiara mentioned, the Hyde Amendment passed the year before Sissy's speech, implemented in 1977, the year of her speech, forbids the use of federal funds distributed by HHS for abortions unless they are abortions for life, rape, and incest. That changed for a period of time, but that's where we are now. Some states use their own funds to pay for medically necessary abortions, 17, but most states, 32, including this one, follow the Hyde standard or have a more restrictive standard. As Khiara mentioned, women who receive Medicaid feel the sting of Hyde most acutely. I found a study that estimated 50% of Medicaid women who would have terminated an abortion, terminated a pregnancy had they had Medicaid coverage, do not and carry their pregnancy to term. So fast forward to 2010, and the Affordable Care Act follows the Hyde suit. Federal funds subsidizing new health care insurance marketplaces may not be used for abortion coverage except for Hyde grounds. And insurers, at least in theory, may offer plans that include abortion coverage so long as they follow the segregation rules that many of you probably are aware of, that the portion covered that covers abortion is paid for by the subscriber and not with federal funds. Insurance companies that offer abortion coverage for individuals with subsidized plans, so the premium-assisted tax credits, cost-sharing reduction payments, have to estimate the cost of abortion coverage in the bill at least $1, which is, if you do health law, particularly infuriating because it's a made-up actuarial value and that abortion coverage saves money. It shouldn't cost anything additional in an insurance plan, as it had and was the state of affairs before the ACA. And issue a bill that separates the cost of abortion and the cost of all other benefits. So insurance companies have to maintain separate accounts and in theory have to report to insurance commissioners the details of how they segregate money. The real thing I wanted to point out today in terms of abortion funding is 23 states have essentially mimicked the ACA and passed bans on abortion dollar coverage for plans offered through the new marketplaces. I guess they're not going to be so new pretty soon, or they may not exist in some states, depending on Burwell. Including 8 states that now ban insurance coverage of abortion more broadly in all private insurance plans regulated by the state. If you thought that was enough for Congress, there is, for example, now the subtly named No Taxpayer Funding for Abortion and Abortion Insurance Full Disclosure Act that has been introduced for several years, which further tries to segregate and limit any federal money touching abortion. And just last week or a week or so ago, as a condition for extending funding to federally funded community health centers, an amendment that prohibits abortion on Hyde grounds as part of a larger bill fixing Medicare reimbursement. So the funding issue isn't getting better. It's not changing. And as Khiara said, there was this moment in 2009. I was a lawyer for the National Partnership for Women and Families, which was the Women's Legal Defense Fund, where we thought we could repeal Hyde. We thought we would sneak in language into the Affordable Care Act that would repeal Hyde grounds. And we were wrong. We were wrong about that. We were wrong about the will to legislate to restrict women from accessing any state money for abortion care. The second issue that I think has real salience for this audience are the restrictions on abortion providers when that force clinics to close, trap laws that impose costs felt by all women. And at dinner last night, Khiara and I had a great conversation about our presentations, and it reminded me to introduce this topic with the caveat that for many women, without trap laws, $400, $500 is an impossible amount to pay. So clinic closures affect different populations of women, but funding restrictions still hurt the most vulnerable women in the United States. So in the last few years, between 2011 and 2013, there have been over 200 abortion restrictions passed by states. That is more than the total 189 from the 10 years previous to 2011. Trap laws are on the march, and the example that I look to in thinking about today was HB 2, passed by the state of Texas, that enacted a number of familiar restrictions, requirements that facilities provide abortions are ambulatory surgical centers, that abortion providers have admitting privileges at nearby hospitals, and that the use of medical abortion follow an outdated FDA protocol. So litigation in HB 2 is ongoing. Fifth Circuit hearing arguments in January of this year. The admitting privileges requirement for doctors on the issue of the ambulatory surgical center requirement. The admitting privileges requirement for doctors in El Paso and McAllen, suspended by the Supreme Court's injunction in October of last year. As that last sentence implies, there are a number of twists and turns in the litigation around HB 2, but I just wanted to very briefly emphasize the cost, what women pay when clinics close or and when funding is scarce. So what does the reality that 10% of Texas women of reproductive age live over 100 miles away from an abortion provider, or even 150 miles away, as the Fifth Circuit said wasn't an undue burden, what does that look like? It's now a matter of debate among the circuits what Justice O'Connor meant when she wrote in Casey that, quote, at some point increased costs could become a substantial obstacle. We don't know what that point is. It seems that according to the Fifth Circuit, 150 miles, not that point. In other places, could be that point. 200 miles, 100 miles. When does the increased cost of travel, of time, of missing work create an undue burden on women's abortion rights? So what struck me in reading about the litigation around HB 2 was the depiction of the economic geography of Texas, the reminder. For example, most of the counties in the Rio Grande Valley, which already face a scarcity of abortion providers, McAllen being had been the closest clinic, are plagued by persistent poverty. That is, close to 40% of counties in the Rio Grande Valley live at or below 100% of the federal poverty level. So that's $11,000 a year for an individual. And 20% of those residents, I'm sorry this is a lot of numbers, but I was really revved up in doing the research, 20% live on half of that, so $6,000, $5,000 a year. In West Texas, if HB 2 is fully implemented, both clinics in El Paso will close and the clinic in Lubbock may close. Women in West Texas will have no abortion provider until they reach San Antonio or Fort Worth. Clinics already serving all of the women in those metropolitan areas. So Judge Eagle, did I say that right? Yes. Federal District Court recognized some of the practical realities for women seeking abortion after HB 2. When we talk about abortion funding and abortion costs, we're not just talking about the price of abortion, which is already steep, but loss of income from work, the presumption that transportation is easy, that one has a private car, that you have child care, that you can pass border checkpoints, that you can stay overnight to comply with waiting periods. He wrote all that in his decision in Lakey. But now it's in front of the Fifth Circuit again. And I read competing accounts of what's going to happen. But I talk about it here to incorporate my phone call, Sissy's reaction in that speech, which is, if the court takes off its blindfolds, if they take their blindfolds off, what are they going to see? Are they going to see the reality I just described, or will they see something else? And her speech, as Khiara noted, was a bit, there are reasons to despair. But there are also reasons to have hope, and that's what I'd like to end on. The third way to think about cost and funding are what national, regional, local organizations can do to help provide abortion services to women and to direct the $1 million budgets of the Center for Reproductive Rights, Planned Parenthood, National Federation, to direct that money to a more radical agenda. I was struck yesterday when Sissy said she was so far to the left so as to be toppling off. Well, I'd like to invite the reproductive rights movement to topple off. And that's what I'd like to pose as a topic of conversation.
I'm so alarmed that you're reaching the end of your presentation.
It's time to wake up.
Me? I first want to thank Rapoport Center and the Law School for the honor of being invited to this event altogether. And then I want to recognize what an honor it is to be among these prestigious speakers on this panel. It's a very high honor for me. And I'd like to correct one minor error in my biography. I did not graduate from the University of Houston. The only thing I graduated from was Galena Park High School in Texas prison. Otherwise, I'm still kind of on my way to go there. I'd like to take you back to 1978, because the entire advance of LGBT equality struggle has happened in my adult lifetime. And I, fortunately, have been pretty close to the hinge point of all that time. That is very rapid movement, Curtis, for any movement to go through those kind of changes in that remarkably short period of time. And my presentation bears the message that Sissy Farenthold was clairvoyant at seeing the future of that movement, and she articulated it as early as 1978. In 1977, the term gay community in Houston, Texas, meant the part of town where the bars were. That was the whole of the meaning of the gay community. Anita Bryant came into town, and being a good organizer, we put together a little demonstration on the occasion of her arrival. The police said, "How many people are you going to have?" I said, "About 500. I ain't never seen a 500-person demonstration in Houston, not the anti-war movement, not civil rights movement, not for any movement. We had 12,000. And that was an event that not only woke up the whole city that we exist, but the people that marched angrily past Anita's hotel on their way to City Hall came back not angry individuals, but a group of people with common goals and aspirations. And being the principal organizer of that event, I was walking back to my car thinking, we are now a community, but we have no institutions to sustain a community. At the time, I was having an argument with a colleague of mine, you may have heard of him, Harvey Milk. He wanted to have a march on Washington on the 10th anniversary of Stonewall to commemorate that seminal event in the gay and lesbian and transgendered history movement. And I wanted to have a National Lesbian and Gay Transgendered Congress because we were not a national movement at all. We didn't have any priorities. Nobody had sat down and applied any democratic process to coming up with what it is that we want. We were basically local movements, and that needed direction to have its strength. So I was conceptualizing along those lines while he was talking about getting people on buses and trains and planes and getting to Washington, D.C. To have demonstrations. But Harvey and I met in June, a week before Town Meeting 1, in Dallas, and argued that out. And that argument was recorded, and he won the argument. I conceded. Nobody surrenders an argument on the scene. That happens later after you consider what your opponents had to say. But Harvey and I didn't have time to mess around, so I conceded. And then I went back to Houston, where I had already planned Houston Town Meeting 1. Now, you other activists know how this works. You can take credit for planning, but in reality, in the process, you make it look as democratic as possible. You bring in people of different races and genders and ages and ideological positions, and everybody takes a vote on everything, but you also know that it's your responsibility to make these things happen. That's the nature of activism. And so I'd conceptualized, and the idea of Town Meeting 1 was to create the institutions that would sustain the community that had been born when Anita came to town the year before. Out of that grew Montrose Counseling Center, Montrose Clinic, Montrose Sports Association, Lesbian Softball, which is an institution that will endure forever, Gay and Lesbian Hispanic Unidas, and all kinds of organizations that would sustain a community. Many of those organizations still exist. To keynote that speech, Sissy Farenthold's name came up. And the committee that we had assembled, I said, you know, we're going to have some pretty good speakers. I can yarn just about as good as anybody. My co-chair was Jenny Apuzzo from New York. And if you don't know who she was the principal speech writer for Mario Cuomo, who is best known for his oratory. So behind every great speaker is probably a large lesbian with a pencil. So I knew that audience was going to be well served, but when they said Sissy Farenthold, and I remember the crusade. It wasn't a campaign, it was a crusade. We had hope. We had promise. And even 1973, after the race, Dolph Briscoe pardoned the remaining inmates in Texas prison that had been sentenced to life in prison for multiple convictions of the sodomy law. I partied with them on the day before they left the prison system. The advantage of being a convict is you're in prison with people about to get out. And Sissy, the first time I saw Sissy's speech in print, Fred Pies, who had driven her to the event, had it printed in a German script worthy of Gutenberg. And it distributed in the community. When you read it, if you just read it, it lasts about 11 minutes. But that day, it was interrupted with 9 standing ovations. An 11-minute speech interrupted by 9, not just warm applause, but standing ovations. That group of people was so hungry for Sissy Farenthold, as she said, a straight white woman with 4 children, to get up and freely offer them acceptance when they were struggling with their self-acceptance. You know, they really didn't have to oppress gay people. We were already oppressed by our guilt and our shame that was imposed upon us by a larger cultural gestalt. We grew up ashamed and guilt-ridden about who we were. And Sissy Farenthold, at a very important tangential moment, stood before us and told us we were worthy. Every one of those standing ovations was deserved. Wasn't anticipated. They didn't expect that. But they were so ready for it, they responded to it so spontaneously. So when you get your hands on her script of that, it's not in Gutenberg German script. It's basically typed with interesting notes in the margin, because I have a feeling that speech was being cooked on the way to the event, like Lincoln did his revisions to the Gettysburg Address on the train going down there. A real human experience. Well, where the hell did she get the idea of who we were? How did that happen? Well, in this conference, I have been more exposed to who she was. The struggles of women for acceptance and equality may be different in degree and temperament, but it was the same struggle. My mother, who was a labor organizer, said, Ramwine, don't ever forget there is only one picket line. And it goes from the equality for blacks and Hispanics and the poor, and it goes through the labor movement, and it goes through civil rights, and it goes through justice, and it goes through all of these things. Find your place on that picket line and take your stand. We all, if we call ourselves activists, take our stand somewhere behind Frances Sissy Farenthold.
Okay, I've just been given the perfect opening because don't ever forget there is only one picket line. The theme of my remarks is we have forgotten that there is only one picket line. I was delighted to hear that Sissy was also someone inclined to pessimism because I am myself pessimistic about, for example, the subject of our panel. National reproductive rights and gay rights, unexpected trajectories. So one of these unexpected trajectories that I'm not at all unhappy about is that how fast gay rights has come, how quickly. But reproductive rights has not come as fast and may have even gone backwards. Worse, these trajectories have moved apart. They are not seen as part of a single enterprise, except by very few among us, and Sissy Farenthold was then, remains one. I'm also not very good at following orders, so I'm going to be talking about Sissy's words, but almost none of the words in the things that we were presented with. I'm going to begin with some of the conversation from yesterday. When the questioner started talking about, quote, whichever buckets you want to live in, gender, LGBT, race, civil rights, some would say things are getting worse, not better. And I've been taught by my friends in the international human rights community to call these buckets silos. And whether they're silos for lobbing missiles at the opposition or silos for hoarding grain for yourself, they enclose constituencies very tightly, distant from one another, not seeing the connections. Now, for me, it's even worse than that, because who is now seeing the connections? It's the people who are on the other side from us. And I'm going to devote most of my remarks to the way in which Catholicism has changed over the time period when Sissy was able to say, I am a Catholic and a politician and a personal opponent of abortion and a believer in choice. I should note in passing that Sissy is more than one kind of nobility, I found. I found that in her family there is Vatican nobility, that her aunt was a lady of the Grand Cross of the Holy Sepulchre under Pius XII. But so I'm going to be talking about two things of interest in my own work, toilets and clothing, which are seen to be silly, but we heard yesterday about the tie. I'm going to say more about the toilets. The clothing I want to talk about, though, is what the Catholics call the seamless garment. And this was a phrase normally attributed to Francis Cardinal Bernardin, but I learned that it was actually developed by Eileen Egan, a co-founder of the peace organization Pax Christi, in the context of the peace movement. And the seamless garment is the notion that all the life issues have something to do with one another. Today, the Vatican sees all of the sex, gender, sexuality issues having something to do with each other and cathects them under the term gender, which it demonizes. Benedict XVI actually said that the concept of gender would destroy humanity, would make us all psychotic. There are hundreds of thousands of people are in the streets of Paris after same-sex marriage saying no to the gender ideology. I wish I could say Pope Francis feels differently about this, but he has also spoken against the terrible influence of the gender ideology in international women's human rights. And it's not, and this is something, again, that where they see the connections and we don't. Similarly, with respect to the Equal Rights Amendment, back in the day, I read that Sissy said that she had not supported the ERA before she joined the legislature because the state bar was against it. She had a tradition of timidity. And she then found that women could not serve on a criminal jury in Texas. When she researched why the federal judges thought this, she said they had two reasons to oppose the change. First, there were 254 courtrooms. It would be too expensive to build 254 additional restrooms. Second, they claimed that women would be too preoccupied with what was going on at home with the children. After that modest research, I co-sponsored the ERA. So this put me in mind with the notion that Phyllis Schlafly, also a Catholic, pointed out that the ERA would do all of these terrible connected things. It would destroy the family. It would require unisex restrooms. It would put women in the military. And it would lead to same-sex marriage. And, of course, all those things are true. So the difference between me and the Catholic right, from the Vatican to Phyllis Schlafly, is not what we see when we connect the dots. It's that their dreams are my nightmares and vice versa. But I am very sorry to see that people on my side of the debate do not make these connections anymore. And in particular, they also do not make the connections to the poor, which allows the Vatican to say we are the representatives of the poor women of the third world, and you airy-fairy first world people who are interested in these luxury issues like reproductive rights and gay rights do not really understand what folks need. And so there's a sense in which Sissy saw this all coming, saw Hobby Lobby coming, when she said that the proponents of the second women's movement in the 60s and 70s thought we would be able to bring a great variety of women together, but there was a backlash to that hope for convergence, some of it based on religion. For instance, the Equal Rights Amendment was defeated, I'm still quoting Sissy, was defeated principally by the Mormon Church and the insurance companies, and the choice issue divides women as well. So I think it was prescient to focus on how religion could be seen to divide. And what we need to remember is how religion can be seen to unite. And I think there are remnants in the Catholic Church today of the seamless garment of the left from the 70s, and I think in particular the Leadership Conference on Women Religious, who were under Vatican Inquisition for their quote-unquote radical feminism and their excessive focus on abortion and gay rights and reproductive rights more generally, to the exclusion of the other things the Catholic Church cared about. They were under investigation. That investigation has not been stopped, but their vision has no longer been embraced. And the final prescient thing, I think, that Sissy said in a 1975 Studs Terkel interview was that Texas has a private government. And she was asked decades later, do you think that's changed? No, it's even more so. That's pretty scary. And she said she still had the capacity for anger about it. And this, again, I'm using all this to feed into my own obsessions. And one of my own obsessions is something that I think of as the new feudalism, right? That more and more, rather than less and less, our rights as Americans are the function of our attachments to our family, to our employer, to our church, to our state, and our rights, the ACA is a horrible example of this, are dependent on those affiliations in such a way as we do not, as individuals, liberal individuals in both senses of the word, have freedom to form our own attachments, and those attachments limit the rights. So the church is denying insurance, or the state is denying insurance. And again, I wish I could see the dream vision of Sissy coming presciently to life in the world. But I see the nightmare vision of Sissy, unfortunately, much more clearly in the modern world. But the dream is still there for the future for us to hang on to.
Okay, I think we're going to start with a few minutes of discussion amongst the panelists. And I wanted to start broad by trying to link together the two strands, the reproductive rights strand and the gay rights strand. And the first question that I was hoping a number of you could reflect on is the gay rights model a movement? Is the gay rights movement a model for the reproductive rights movement? And here's the question, right? On the one hand, the gay rights movement has shot forward, great successes, fabulous popularity, unbelievable social change on that front, an undeniable success. But when I think about the call that Khiara and Rachel are making toward more radicalism as what's necessary in the abortion context, I think, I'm not sure if that describes the gay rights movement right now, which is primarily seeking marriage, and just recently had great victories in terms of admittance to the military, right? So marriage and the military as two of the main areas where that movement has gotten great success. On one hand, you could see it as radical. Obviously, that's radical social change, and it came about very quickly. On the other hand, those are some of the most stalwart conservative institutions in our society. And so I wanted to have numerous of you reflect on the question of whether that movement is a model, what the reproductive rights movement could learn from it, whether it should pattern itself on the model, or whether that's a cautionary tale, actually, and the reproductive rights movement should look elsewhere when it thinks about how to go forward.
Ideologically, I believe the gay and lesbian movement is not so much a model for, but I think we have stolen a model from the reproductive rights and the women's equality movement. We are their children. Now, we were able to show significant, rapid success because of two phenomena. One of them is their ability to utilize the media more effectively than anybody else in the world, simply because strategic people within our movement understood the media. And we have a class of, like, writers. I mean, Edward Albee, Tennessee Williams, Gertrude Stein, that are writers and know how to parse words together. That is in our cultural tradition, and we've robbed that from them, and I think we've used it very effectively as media itself has evolved. So one of the things that I am concerned about the reproductive rights movement is they're not very effective at using the media. They do not hear that voice of suffering women in those barrios down along the border who cannot get the services that they desperately need in order to have some sense of security, economic and otherwise, within their families. We need to hear those voices. We need to see those women. And we need to create media and ability to expose that is important. Women's reproductive rights is not an academic topic, though academics spend a lot of time talking about it. Women's reproductive rights are a human topic that has real, right now, victims, and we need to see that. As much criticism, I mean, we were talking the history of yesterday Texas politics. Lyndon Johnson did not come across very well. But if you were a poverty student in a barrio school in the valley, when he was a teacher in that school, there would have been no replacement for Lyndon Johnson. And it had affected not only those children, but not very much, but he made an attempt to make an effect. It affected Lyndon Johnson for the rest of his life. So seeing and experiencing is something. So when a gay man or a lesbian gets bludgeoned on the street, it doesn't happen in silence. There is no closet. When gay men were dying in large numbers of HIV and AIDS, we didn't avoid your seeing it. We brought the vision of that into your living rooms and into your newspapers.
I just want to add, so my initial reaction is to say, So I like the way you phrased it. LGBT rights are radical in the sense that, they are fighting for inclusion into the body politic, and it's a body politic that is never contemplated. Like the body politic was one that was built on actively excluding this, particular types of people who with, abnormal, deviant gender identities and sexual preferences. So I feel, so it's radical in that sense, but it's also very conservative in the sense that it's as the LGBT rights, the way I see it, they're asking for inclusion into the body politic without challenging what exactly the body politic is. It's a very heteronormative body politic. It's one that is, a marriage is a very traditional institution, so asking for inclusion into this very traditional institution is, one can understand it, is not very radical at all. Asking for participation into the military, so yes, it's radical that we're including LGBT folks in the military, but the military is like, that's what America is. Like, we drop bombs on people, and if you want to be, a participant in dropping bombs, that is, it doesn't challenge, our identity as a nation. And so, so it's both conservative and it's radical. I feel like reproductive rights and justice, I feel like that movement, it might have to take a different tack because it is challenging, gender norms about what it means to be a woman. It's challenging, women are not necessarily meant to grow up in order to become mothers. Like, women like to have sex with men without reproducing. Women like to have sex with women without reproducing. I feel like that's what, I feel like the challenge is a little bit different that reproductive justice and reproductive rights represent. And so maybe that's why a different tact has to be taken. Also, the way you described, Rachel, and my feeling about it, as we were asking for a little bit more radical movement. I don't feel like contemplating environmental justice and immigration policy and labor practices, and I don't feel like that's actually very radical at all. It's just more holistic, right? It's more complex. It's contextualizing women's lives, but not sure radical would be the word that I would use for it.
I'd just add briefly that my first thought was also about the role of sex and the depiction of illicit sex. That was part of a discourse early on around abortion. I really enjoyed Louise's presentation about the sexuality of birth control and having sex free from procreation. But I think that there is a commonality of how depiction of marriage. You could think about marriage equality and the same-sex marriage movement as, and many people have made this argument, as reviving marriage, which was an institution on the decline in terms of cohabitation, recognition, and other forms of relationships. And then we have Goodridge and a number of other cases where we have the perfect married couples. And so there's something also about that, the depiction of people in those marriages that strikes me as similar and de-radicalized as women who have abortion because of health or trauma or need, not because they don't want to be pregnant and they just happen to be pregnant. So I think I make a connection there that I don't want to take up a lot of time, but I'm happy to talk about further. I think a radicalization would be the move that is not part of the mainstream, and I said multi-million. I mean, the CRR is an $18 million organization in revenue. They're not promoting do-it-yourself abortions. They're not promoting, misoprostol as a way to terminate a pregnancy outside of a clinic setting. There's lots of things we can say about that. But there are radical items on an agenda that change the discourse.
I wanted to comment on this this question of the marriage because our case was presenting a view of marriage, and that was a kind of ideal kind of view of what we sometimes call in the early days called companionate marriage. And I was saying to someone that I see myself in that vision, because that was my vision, as something that I derived from the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s when I was a girl, because I'm a 50s person. And almost immediately in 61, 60s, you got the birth control pills. Then you had, women's lib. I haven't heard that word for a long time, until yesterday. And so it switched off. And but then you had the tying of abortion to health, as they did in Griswold. In other words, the health of women, the kind of medicalized view, rather than women's expression of themselves. And so I think that the whole question of revisiting marriage now is a very difficult issue. And it's not tied in people with monies. They are not, those women are not getting birth control. They are getting birth control. And one of the interesting things about the reaction to my op-ed piece in 2012 was enormous outpouring, including Valerie Jarrett, of people who said it's so important because our daughters do not understand the importance of birth control. They don't think it's important at all. And they don't understand the importance of birth control, not only in terms of the disconnect from poor women, but also because they didn't see the connection between their life and careers and their ability to be mothers. So with birth control, because there was not a connection, but there is a connection in terms of how do we live well-lived lives where we can expand and be all things, including important in society. And I'm very interested in that, the noble citizen idea, meaning that we all should be able to be part of our society and be political as well as being mothers, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's part of the problem now with the reproductive rights, is that the links between, it's getting farther apart, between the women who have all this professional education, who have all the chances in the world, and then you have the book Lean In, about, now what's new about Lean In? What's new is here's a woman that everything, she's confronting the same issues and trying to help, but she doesn't go back to the birth control issue, because of course that was not a problem for her. So there's a real question, I think, about how we're able to put the thing together in a way that is moving to people, and I believe the media is it. But I was really struck that response to my op-ed piece was from the women of my generation, and slightly younger, and not being feeling that they were very concerned that there was not that understanding of the importance of ability to control reproduction and able to be the life you wanted.
So I have too many thoughts on this, and I'll try to organize them, and I'll start by saying that I think one of the trajectories that the movements have in common is we've come away from liberation, right, and the joy of liberation. That one of the things that both movements made successful was starting with pain. That it was Romer v. Evans and the notion of gay bashing unremedied that led to the marriage movement, and the notion of the coat hanger abortion. We don't have a notion of good sex in this society. Sex is about fear, or it's not something to be talked about. I wrote in 1993 that the successful gay rights plaintiffs were not members of sexually active couples. They were all people whose partner was either dead, disabled, or in prison. Note that Windsor's partner was dead. If you do any homework, you will see a fabulous documentary film about the great sex they had during the 20 years she was disabled, but I don't know whether Anthony Kennedy saw that film. The named plaintiff in this case, Obergefell, is a widower. I don't think that's an accident. I am very disturbed by, every time I debate Maggie Gallagher in the National Organization of Women, I say if you really are in favor of marriage and not against gay people, you should be kissing the feet of gay people because no one has done more to make marriage the gold standard. One of the things that I am pessimistic about is not only are we not where at the turn of the millennium I thought we were going to be, we're not where I thought at the turn of the millennium we were with respect to recognition of alternate family forms. So, I have a little bit of an allergy when I saw the word noble and noble citizen, because nobility, my sense is that what the court is about to do, starting with Windsor in the new opinion that's going to be forthcoming, is make marriage a title of nobility, right? That the noble citizen is the married citizen and everybody else is one down. And I thought we had a constitutional objection to those sorts of titles of nobility. And the final thing I will say is that there is, again, the siloization on identitarianism. One of the things that has made the gay rights movement successful has been that it can be seen to be this small minority that the likes of Ted Olson and boys who heroically ride in to do the Prop 8 case can feel like they're doing good for. They don't make the connection at all, though it's legally there to be made, between same-sex marriage and the Ruth Bader Ginsburg revolution in sex discrimination. I psychoanalyze them and say, why is that? Because they can be the knights on the white horses for gay people, but if they make a connection between the old bad laws of marriage that Ruth Bader Ginsburg and others caused to be made unconstitutional, they have to think about their own marriages. These are each much married men. Now, it's true that one of Olson's wives was tragically lost on 9/11, but he's been through a few, and you couldn't double what either of them did and raise a family. So they, don't want to ride to the rescue of the feminist movement because that may be more of a threat to them.
Yeah, so numerous of you picked up on something that I wanted to ask about, which is sex or sexuality. It's really amazing. Louise has dug up this brief in the Trubeck case where the lawyer is talking in the late 50s, early 60s about we need birth control so that people can enjoy sex and they can have lots of sex and they can have sex without having children. And that is not the way it would be framed at the Supreme Court today. Right? That was a long time ago that seemed a plausible thing for a lawyer to say. And so I guess I wanted to ask, here I wanted to pick up something Marianne said that I thought was very interesting about how Catholics are making the connections between these things, and they especially talk about the connections between gender, ideology, and poverty. And one other thing they do is talk about sexuality a lot and have it as a robust part of their conversation in a way that the left, ironically, perhaps doesn't. And so I particularly wanted to ask maybe Ray, Rachel, Khiara, but everybody, do you think that the movement that you talked about should make sexuality and pleasure more central to its claim?
Well, I think that's the importance of Griswold. Griswold is a privacy case. It established the foundation of the privacy of the marriage bed. And that is the cornerstone of everything we've done about privacy. People say Lawrence was the last decision. No, actually, there was another decision from Dallas dealing with dildos. I wanted it to be styled Texas versus Pleasures, but the judge saw that coming because it was the name of the bookstore, so we changed it to the holding company. But that is based on the progression of privacy since Griswold. But I want to make one thing clear. Remember that woman that told me about the picket line from Horizon to Horizon, catch it? She was my mother. That was Frankie Hill. And everybody knows about gay men and their mothers. It's iconic. The other thing she said is, Wayne, don't ever do anything in your life that may ultimately lead to family court. And I still think that is good advice. I fight the cause of marriage equality on the basis of the equality part, that everybody should be entitled to make those decisions themselves. And I am confident that that will be successful because Ruth Ginsburg is driving this train in Washington, D.C. And so on June the 25th, 2015, marriage equality will be the law of the land.
I love the question. In fact, I was thinking in my earlier response about marriage on steroids, that for those of you who know the website Some E-Cards, with one of the first cases that granting same-sex couples the right to marry, they posted on their website a picture that said, "Congratulations, welcome to sexless drudgery, like everyone else." And so, but it's this idea that marriage is a sexless institution, as conceived to be the good plaintiffs. And I was writing Marianne note that there's an article in the New Yorker that really was very, I thought, very touching, very revealing about the sexual heat of Edie Windsor and Thea Spire, as Marianne noted, and that her lawyers in this article said, you have to shut up about having sex to be a plaintiff in this case. You cannot talk about this before we get to court. And that story didn't really come out as popularly as it did until after. So those are examples that come to mind that to become mainstream, there is something about fitting into these narratives about sexuality, which are not about pleasure or empowerment or liberation, but are about taming and subordination and are stereotyped. And it strikes me that the reproductive rights movement is still at the height of its donations and its gifts. The Jill Lepore article is still making money, but doing so within a framework that is also not explicit about sexuality, not necessarily explicit about abortion as a form of birth control. There are lines that are not crossed that correspond in many ways with ideas of women's sexuality. And I think that, I guess my reaction is there are trade-offs. There are movement trade-offs to how you are going to package ideas that sit uncomfortably with our feelings and responses and traditions around sex. You're going to give up some donors, but you may advance more interesting ideas about sexuality. And so I'm not so pessimistic as those examples I listed would imply, because I do think in both movements, and I'll just speak for the reproductive justice movement, there are these great seeds of queer sex, of sexual, of different ideas about what sex is that help motivate and attract people into those movements as places to talk about sex differently. I just don't think it's what's easily marketed to Hewitt, Gates, and big donors. That's my take.
So I am, once again, more pessimistic. So, the old pleasure and danger, we've gone all the way in terms of the danger, and I'm both in the abstinence-only sexual education on the right and in the reproductive justice movement on the left. And you mentioned the Texas sex toys case. I think of the Alabama sex toys case, which came out the other way. It was, I thought, a brilliantly litigated case, litigated during the time Lawrence was going up to the Supreme Court and after, and brought together a perfect congeries of plaintiffs, including women so traumatized by bad relationships that they wanted solitary sexual pleasure, married couples who said that only with the aid of sex toys could they have a fulfilling relationship. I mean, you had, the most sympathetic kind of people. I mean, you could have a sex toys case about a, dirty old man and a life-size doll with 3 orifices. But no, this was a women's case, a married person's case, a responsible person's case. And the district court judge kept sending it up and sending it up and sending it up and getting smacked down. And that, I think, is unfortunately more, there, as a connect the dots doctrinalist, I see no reason after Lawrence and given the obscenity laws, why sex toys should have any ban on them that isn't safety related. I mean, it's either ideas about the thing or the thing itself. But we are not there. And I don't think that more open discussion about it is going to help. The way to be affirmative for the reproductive justice movement, though, however, is open because there's the affirmative sense of reproduction, right? Ruth Bader Ginsburg famously wanted the first case to come up before the court to be of a woman who wanted to have her baby and wasn't given time off from the military to do it, and then was actually distressed as an advocate that the military, so as to move the case, gave her everything she asked for, except the ability to train as a pilot, which was seen as a bridge too far for even Ruth Bader Ginsburg to think she could get anywhere at that point in time. But one of the things the Catholic Church does is equally oppose artificial conception and artificial contraception. So talking about reproductive rights as the right to reproduce, as well as simply the right not to, timing, but also assistance when the medical intervention is facilitation of reproduction. The Catholic Church is firing women for using, from church schools and so on, for letting it be known that in their married reproductive lives they are using the new reproductive technologies, in vitro fertilization, for example.
But we didn't hide from sex in the Lawrence case. The Lawrence case, and read the book, Flagrant Conduct by Dale Carpenter, I index well in that book. When they asked me, tell me about the plaintiffs, well, the plaintiffs, one was white and one was black. The white one was in his late 50s, the black one was in his early 30s. How long had they been together as a couple before they were arrested? It was about 45 minutes. And we did not hide from those facts.
Oh, I mean, I beg to differ with you. I was talking with the people who litigated the case up to the Supreme Court.
Oh, they wanted to hide from the facts.
They hid them very successfully. They made it, for better and for worse, seem like a case about a relationship.
Yeah,
and a relationship in the conventional sense of the word.
The litigants called me, and we had many conversations about what the hell difference does it make, because one is younger than the other and one is a different race than the other, and how long had they been together. But Houston was always adamant in local media about not hiding any of those facts.
I don't think those facts got before the Supreme Court. Let me just put in one last plug. Edie and Thea, Very Long Engagement, the documentary film that was made before the death of Edie Windsor's spouse. There's a lot in it about good sex and its importance to the relationship.
I just want to add one thing, just back to the question of whether we, as activist scholars, et cetera, ought to sort of put emphasis or focus on sex and sexuality and pleasure. I feel like we have to be careful, and the reason why we have to be careful is because our world is one that is shot through with race and class stratification. And I think, to make an argument, the ideas that we get in our head about white women enjoying sex and married white women enjoying sex and single, gay, white or black men enjoying sex, is different from the discourses that attach and the ideas that we have. Society has in its head about poor people having sex and poor black women having sex and poor Latinas having sex. And so we don't need to focus on sex and sexuality for those populations because those populations are already enjoying sexuality and pleasure. The problem is we have to curb it. That's why we have to, impose family caps on them, and that's why we have to, just try to get their, tame their sexuality to one that is more in line with, whatever ideas we have about middle class white folks. So we have to be careful about, making arguments for various populations because various populations, those arguments, especially focusing on sexuality and pleasure, is something that is kind of already unsaid but known.
Yes, I want to follow up because Mary Dudiak, in her article in 1990 on Just Say No, which is the excellent article on the pre-Griswold cases, she has a paragraph there where she talks about this question of the the medical. It was Carl Menninger and Havelock Ellis, if any of you remember that, in that period, with the early days in the 50s. She ties it to suburban domesticity. Mm-hmm. And that was the idea that you would have your house in the suburb, the 50s model. And that part of that was enjoying sex for the, that the men and women could do that because of the birth control. And so, you're quite right that it's tied to a very particular view of where we were going in the 1950s. That was the model. So it's a sort of a two-edged sword. It wasn't a sexual liberation in that sense. It was the enjoying of sex within the marriage and within a certain view of the class structure. So I think that's very important. Now, in the brief, there's no doubt that there's when I read it, I was amazed, and of course, it didn't come from me. I mean, I wanted my career, I wanted my children, I wanted to plan. I didn't envision myself as that an important part. I never would have thought of it. So when I read the brief, that was Fowler Harper. That was the lawyer's view of how he was presenting, why he thought the court would find that interesting. I find it, it's an amazing document in that sense. So, but I was very interested after I read it to read a Mary Duty Act's article, and which she takes that point of view about how that happened. But none of us, so it's an interesting point to think about. That is how much, and nowadays when you have these young women and men, the people you watch Girls or any of these things, it's the next stage that they are fearful of. It's not the 20 stage. It's not fear of pregnancy. It's not fear of they go to the abortion clinic and so forth. But it's how do you handle grown-up life? How do you handle marriage? How do you handle children? How do you handle jobs that are really significant and long-lasting? And so it's a kind of a generational thing, and I think that's going to be one of the issues going forward.
Can I just add, just very quickly, so I think Khiara's point is an incredibly important one to make, and I just want to add that I think that all of us in conceiving about sexuality's role are trying to wrestle with and recognize that whether the state is intervening for antinatalist or pronatalist ends, it is based on perceptions of good and bad sex. So some populations have bad sex because we presume something about their sexuality based on racist, classist ideas. And some people have good sex, or no sex. But I just wanted to pull together all these strands that they fit into very knowable categories that are then very hard to break down. And I think that's what your question was prompting us to do, is to say, what do these movements look like? What happens to them when they don't rely on those categories as a crutch, implicitly or explicitly, but seek to upend them?
And, and Rachel, your point just makes me think about what do we do with the fact, what happens when the state is both antinatalist and pronatalist with poor people? Like, so what does that mean? What kind of sex are they having, right? Because, Medicaid is pronatalist, we won't fund your abortion, and then TANF, family caps, we want you to curb your reproduction. So what in the world are we supposed to do with that? It's just that, it's about autonomy, and it's about the state just wanting to be there. Right? I just want to be in your bedrooms. I want to be in your decision-making processes. I want to control. I want to surveil. I want to oversee. I want to regulate. And so, we have to try to make sense of something that is contradictory with poor people who are, racialized as Black and Latino.
When's the last time you was in a room where a bunch of women, including this gay guy who will qualify enough, are sitting around talking about sex? That doesn't happen very often in the public arena. But Sissy has not avoided those conversations over the years, and I'd like to point out that there's something about Sissy's clarity that reigns on us all, and it's purifying, and it's enriching, and it's empowering.
I would like to turn to the audience to solicit any questions that you might have for the panel.
Hi, y'all. My name is Claudia. I'm the director of the Rapoport Chapter of Houston. Thank you so much for this. I wanted to ask you all to talk about those two movements that you framed, that the panel's framed around, as non-monolithic I think one of the amazing million things about about your examples of your whole life is the ability to bridge between the more mainstream forms of activism, or the forms of activism that take on mainstream institutions, which I feel like is a little bit more what we're talking about here, and then the pieces of movement work that end up more on the margins, which is actually where so much of the creativity and inspiring models actually come from. And so my question is, how can, in the LGBT rights movement and the reproductive rights movement, how can we actually build better bridges within the movement between those poles that are all on that picket line?
Activists of any ilk are about change. And one of the things I learned early on is that comfortable people do not change. And so, although Sissy does it with a great sense of gentleness that the rest of us perhaps do not enjoy, personally, but we can certainly appreciate it in Sissy, my function in any room is to make people uncomfortable. So when they get uncomfortable, they have to think about the points of view that they've had with which they are comfortable. And that thinking process, I don't really save souls anymore. I used to be a teenage evangelist, and I did that. But after I left that trade and went to more honest work and became a burglar and other things, the idea of bringing about change, unlike that debate between Harvey and me, you don't win or lose on the scene. You get people to think, to cause a change, an evolution of change. And that's been true of, I was secretary of the NAACP when I was 18 years old. That was true of that movement in 1958, was to try to get people to think about what they were doing that was wrong. And the commonality that we all have here is we have the absolute assurance in our belief that we are right about women's controlling their reproduction. And we are right. And there's not much debate in this room about that. Well, our opponents think they are equally right in that we should give that control over to the state or the church or whoever wants to be the pretender of that control. And the same is true of, again, lesbian rights movement. The same is true of women's equality movements. So we have to get people first to think if we're going to see any hope of their changing.
I just want to, the question prompted me to think about, I was having a conversation about intersectionality prior to the panel, and the reality is that people, to separate LGBT rights from reproductive rights and justice is a false dichotomy, right? Because the truth is that there are LGBT folks who would love some reproductive rights, right? And it reminds me of, conversations that I've had about, the LGBT rights movement is divorced from racial justice. So how do we bring those two into conversation? Well, we can recognize that a whole bunch of LGBT folks don't have racial privilege, right? So there are people that exist at the intersection of these things that have been falsely dichotomized. Mm-hmm. And the subjects of these movements have been, essentialized. So the LGBT person is, a white person, and the reproductive rights person is a woman, as if those two things don't intersect. So I think we need to recognize people's intersectionalities and then build movements around those intersections. And if we built movements around those intersections, then we wouldn't have to worry about bringing these things together because they actually coexist in real people's lives.
So I wanted to focus on an intersection that may not be a popular one to focus on, which is the intersection between commitment to the issues we care about on the side that everybody on this panel is, and conservatism. Mm-hmm. I think that one of the things that the LGBT movement has done very well is make clear to conservatives, libertarian conservatives, traditional conservatives, why their movement is something that, as a conservative, conservatives should support. Now, it's very risky to do that without compromising your own visions, but for some of the people involved in this, their own vision is compatible with conservatism. I found that in the 2008 presidential election, the most articulate answer Sarah Palin gave to any question asked her was the first time she was asked, "Are you a feminist?" And she started with a one-word answer, "Yes," and then explained how a feminist was, she grew up a feminist because she grew up in Alaska and her father expected boys and girls to do the same thing, and she thought she had opportunity, and she loved Title IX. And I'm not going to vote for Sarah Palin because she's a feminist. I'm certainly not even if she were a feminist because she's a feminist, let alone because she's a woman. But I do think that there are moments of coalition for feminists and conservatives. If she supports Title IX, great. And that, feminists have less successfully, I think, than gay rights advocates kept the connection to people who would, on other issues, identify as conservative.
Yeah, I would say a combination of what everyone said. I mean, I agree very strong with Khiara's point about intersectionality, and I think your remarks about reproductive justice were trying to get at that the reproductive rights movement had to come face to face with the fact that abortion was not the issue for lots and lots of people, and that there are other issues that intersect with the concerns of people who want to reproduce, who want to have access to assisted reproductive technologies. But I'd also just echo Marianne briefly to say that it struck me in our conversation that these links between libertarianism, conservatism, and some of the broader ripple effects of the marriage equality movement are seeing marriage as a completely private, not public, not economic institution that that we don't think there's much in terms of there's not much of stake in having people join that institution because we don't see it. It plays really nicely into a libertarian notion of what marriage is, as an identity, as an emotion, but not as a public institution with economic capacities. So the two ideas not really connected. Sorry.
Really appreciate the opportunity to talk. I've heard Ray several times, had the chance to listen to you talk, and frankly, I don't know anybody who talks sex better than Ray does, truthfully. But I have and I really do mean that in a way that's a thoughtful way that has me coming out thinking about heterosexual sex when you come from the direction that Ray's coming from when he talks about what you don't do in prison. How you behave, what you do. But that's not my question. My question really is, I have a really simple-minded kind of question, which is, I'm wondering, when you put the original question about to Ray, is this a model? Is the gay rights movement a model for reproductive rights? It occurred to me, my simple-minded question that was elucidated by all your comments on it is, aren't we really dealing with gender roles? And you touched on it on marriage. But men are expected, I don't think we'd have gay rights if the men hadn't led the way. I don't think we'd be there. And if they hadn't been so damn sexual about it and made everybody's skin crawl. Because the big criticism about gay rights is, oh, those guys are so sexual, can't they keep it at home? Can't they keep it? Why do they have to be so out there about it? And so but here's what happens. It seems like men are expected to be sexual. And even if they're gay, we can handle that better. And men are expected to be sexual and to do. Whereas with women, we're expected, your comments right, we're not expected to be sexual, and you're sure as hell not expected to do, and isn't that what Sissy's been dealing with forever? You're not expected to do. So I'm just interested in what about this basic, we're expected to be mothers, and of course, we're expected to be mothers, therefore reproductive rights focus on the children. So I'm just wondering if that kind of is too simple-minded to even talk about here, but isn't it underlying a lot of the problem on reproductive rights? And isn't that trajectory why we can get gay rights so much sooner than we can get real reproductive rights?
I'm going to turn to Marianne if you want to jump in. You've written a lot.
I would say amen to that.
Google Marianne Case, you can find a lot
Yeah,
of
it's all
great
there.
writings.
It's all there. I did.
So I would like someone to actually take up this notion of gender roles and how it plays out in.
So I'll have to come back as a pessimist. I do medieval feminism, right?
Yeah.
Men and women, not just women, have been saying for 500, 600, 700, 800 years. It is obvious that, and this is the generation where the change is going to come, and we may not be free, but our granddaughters will. In 1400, in 1600, in 1789. And somehow, and women come up with all of these other movements. And I'm speaking in terms of women, but what I mean is no fixed notions concerning the roles and abilities of males and females, right? The Vatican was in favor, or the Catholic Church is where I learned that there were no fixed notions concerning the roles and abilities of males and females in my 13 years of Vatican II era Catholic education and my study of the medieval church. There's been a retrogression, right? The Vatican obsessing about the extremely gendered nuclear family as its model. I think there's this wonderful book by a gay Protestant theologian called Sex and the Single Savior. If you actually read the New Testament, it's very about roles for women outside of the family, and not about reproduction. But somehow gender roles and the hierarchy in gender roles and the fixity of gender roles comes back. I wish I knew what to do about it, other than despair.
Back to that question, I think white women are expected not to be sexual, and black women are expected to be oversexed. And that's heavy. And it's been there forever. I can remember my father telling me that the only two free people in America were white men and black women, because they were free to have as much sex as they wanted, but white women weren't. I'm a child of 3 generations of the Passage movement, and if anybody wants to learn about the Passage movement, I'd be glad to tell you offline about that. But I wanted to address a question to Marianne. There was a piece on NPR within the last week or so about the women religious case in the Vatican, and it seems like it's being referred to the cardinal in Boston. And I'm wondering, what do you think is going to come out of that? Where is he, and where is he coming from?
I mean, I think more generally, I'm not qualified. I mean, if you gave me a moment to refresh my recollection, I can answer the question more specifically about the Boston Cardinal. Where my head is at now, I will just say more generally that, as with Frances more generally, what's happening with the Leadership Council on Women's Religious is a good news, bad news sort of thing. It's better than it was, but he didn't immediately drop the inquiry. He, has made peace with the nuns, and part of the reason why he has made peace with the nuns is because the things they were stressing and were criticized for overstressing were the social justice issue parts of the seamless garment, were issues of poverty and health care, but he is not going to bless their being radical feminists. He has said that he opposes the gender ideology, and that he seems to believe in complementarity, which is this notion of fixed essences of the sexes, not necessarily fixed sex roles. So again, it's a good news, bad news kind of story that the Leadership Council has come off more unscathed than if Benedict remained the Pope. But part of the other thing that worries me about the Leadership Conference is their age, right? These are a bunch of Sissy's generation of women, and that's not just because they are the women in leadership. but they are not reproducing themselves because there's an exit. I mean, I'm speculating here. There's a bit of an exit, voice, and loyalty problem with respect to women in the church.
Women are not going into convent.
They're going into the priesthood. There is a movement of women who are ordained in the apostolic succession, or they are going to other churches, or they are, like me, leaving organized religion, leaving religion, forget about organized religion entirely. Bringing the values I took from the Catholic Church, to secular work against the Catholic Church.
I think we have time for...
Hi. So Ray touched on the subject of the media's involvement with all of this, and we've talked about linking these two spots on the picket line, and it just makes me think of recently I've seen the media depicting feminism as incredibly negative and incorrect, as only about women and not about the equality of both and of all. So I'm curious, how can feminists stand up for the true goal of equality among all of us and stand up for both reproductive rights, women's rights, and also the LGBT community's rights, especially if we are depicted as extremist or wrong or unfair?
Well, the first place is the media gets it wrong. Don't ask for a retraction, because they've got to tell the story again to put in their retraction. So that just keeps their story alive another day. The answer to bad media coverage is more media coverage. And remember, when you give Lois Lane a story, she owns that story. So it's not what information you give her, but your enduring relationship with Lois Lane, and that's my generic term for reporters of any gender. It's your relationship with Lois Lane, the depth with which Lois Lane understands your issue has something to do with the clarity with which it is reported. And I think people look at media as something that happens incidentally in their causes, when in reality, you need to get ahead of the wave and prepare the reporter to understand your issue and present it within the parameters of your belief. Now, if she puts the opposite story in with your story, fine, that's open competition. You got a right to sell your goods, they got a right to sell their goods. But if you are the true believer in the righteous cause, you will win out in such comparisons every time.
I just want to add a plug for social media. I think social media is an incredibly democratizing force in terms of information. Social media has allowed for information that wouldn't be heard by the major media outlets, the CNNs and the MSNBCs, and God forbid, the Fox News of the world, is allow for that information to actually circulate. I feel strongly that we wouldn't have had agitation around Trayvon Martin, around Mike Brown, around Eric Garner, around a lot of the police brutality that we've experienced in the last year without social media. And so I think that we can use those same channels to get alternative messages about feminism, about racial justice, about whatever it is out there. I think is really important. It's no longer we're pleading for 5 networks to cover our stories. It's like, let's cover our stories and let's put it out there.
I will say, I think actually feminists do a pretty good job supporting the LGBT movements, and the real problem is getting men to support feminist issues, that men both gay and straight. And I'm quite concerned that once the issues of interest to powerful gay men who would otherwise be Republicans or are still log cabin Republicans are settled in a way that they find satisfactory, that they will do even less than they previously had for the interests of women, both gay and straight. And we still haven't gotten heterosexual men to do much.
I had a question and comment, but I think some of it has been addressed, and it was going back to the issue of gender roles. And how do we learn how do each of the movements learn from each other? And I think that gay marriage is also an opportunity for the reproductive rights movement, in the sense that it's an opportunity to redefine roles within a relationship that is an institution that is accepted and so entrenched in our society. So can we learn from a different idea of what our companions' roles are? That isn't to say that it's perfect in gay marriage, because the problem with gender roles is that they're so deeply entrenched in our psyche that they're also entrenched in the psyche of many gay and lesbian couples. So it takes time to change it, but I think it's an opportunity to change it because it's about human rights. It's about seeing one person as equal to another and as equally capable. So I don't have to rear the children, though I am physically the only one capable of bearing them. And it's getting that across to men, and that goes to the point of getting men involved in feminist issues. But I think that when you use the word feminist, what you do is turn them away, because it's not about them. It's about the female. So we have to make it about the men. We have to reframe the issues. How does this help you in your relationships? How does this help you with your family? How does this help you with your children? How does it help you with your work and with your own vision of what society should be like? That's not easy, and it's not a quick thing, but I think that that's where the answer lies.
I mean, I agree with you that that might make the sales job easier. I also agree with the implicit premise that it is of benefit to men, not just a handicap to men. But I note that most minority civil rights movement, from the LGBT movement to the Black civil rights movement, have gotten members of the powerful majority to go along in the interests of justice, not only in self-interest. And so why this has been less true of the feminist movement, either that we've been able to sell it as in the self-interest of men, which I think it more obviously is, than that it's in the self-interest of the white power elite to cede power to African Americans in the South. I
don't think feminists have done that bad a job. I actually think that many men do think of themselves as feminists, and there's a cachet to it, and it's not because of self-interest, it's because of justice, and it's for other reasons. And I just want to complicate what we mean when we say feminist. I think there are lots of strands of feminist thinking. Some have sticking power, and some are what inform the marginalized idea of feminism, radical feminism, dominance feminism. But, you know, I want to push back that it's only a story of marginalization, because it's also a story of wild success in many ways. So I appreciate the comment, and we might.
I'm always happy to see wild success. Show me.
This group has a lot of conversation to enjoy among ourselves, and it's got to be that. But just before I came to this panel, I was having a discussion about safe shelter for transgendered women. And that's a very valid issue, because not only the gay community, but everybody else has a little difficulty with guys, people who are born guys and they wear dresses. So to me, it comes as a nuts and bolts pragmatic. What do I pragmatically do about the problem of these people suffering? Well, get the mayor to appoint a transgender judge to go into the College of Municipal Judges and advocate for folks of her kind. That's a practical thing you can do, and you just can't ignore Judge Phyllis Fry. She's too much of a significant person in any college of people that she travels in. She's a damn good lawyer and a wonderful judge. Doing that ameliorated the problem that when a police officer encounters a transgendered woman on the street, it is his or her assumption they are a prostitute. And by having the first line of defense being municipal court, you cut that off right there.
So I will say, To the extent that it is a story about the individual Phyllis Fry, whom I admire, I'm with you. But to the extent that it's a story about identity, and that only someone of a given identity can represent that identity, and in particular the trans identity, I worry a great deal. I mean, I find it quite distressing that the notion that there should be no fixed notions concerning the roles and abilities of males and females, including about things like dress codes, was much more prominent before the turn of the millennium than it is now. And if you look at litigation about driver's licenses, about yearbook photos, about school dress codes, someone is more likely to be able to go against the rigid sex-specific dress code if they are prepared to claim a trans identity, and those who are not lose. So a girl who just says, I'm sorry, but the drape and pearls is not me, can't I wear the shirt, loses. But once she says, I'm a lesbian, or even better, I'm really a man, then suddenly her descriptive chance for getting a judge to say, go ahead, increases tremendously. And that seems to me a giant step backwards, not forwards.
So I am so sorry to cut off this amazing conversation, but I need to do it. And I want to thank the panelists, and I hope we'll continue to talk throughout the day. But I also wanted to thank Sissy and just to remark how amazing it is that the documents she produced leads to this kind of conversation. Right? It's a really remarkable set of documents and set of conversations that it spawns. So thank you very much.
This has been so much fun. Thank you.